Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast. This week we'll be discussing the P-61 Black Widow. As usual, we have Cobey here,
Hello.
and we have a new addition, Captain Roan.
Hey there.
You want to tell somebody something about you, Roan? Little intro?
Sure. I am a professional pilot. I fly for a living. Not going to say who I fly for, but I fly large aircraft on a regular basis, and I teach people how to fly on the side.
So the P-61 is an aircraft that I feel many War Thunder players didn't really know much about, or maybe they knew existed, but they don't know the overall intricacies of this aircraft. It's a very complex aircraft that actually didn't see a ton of action, but it's still a pretty cool piece of aviation. We're gonna start with talking about Jack Northrop, the head of that company, and then we're gonna move through the design and production of the P-61 and a little bit of its post-war life. Before we get kicking off on that, I want to invite all of you, if you have any 5-kill Air RB rounds you'd like to send me, we're going to do another podcast down the road, and I happily use that footage for that video. So any 5-kill Air RB games, you want to send that to bohicaice@gmail.com. It may be featured in a podcast down the road. All right, Jack Northrop, you want to talk about him, Cobey?
Well, yeah, he was a fucking genius. I can tell you that much. He was very hard to work with, evidently. He liked to do his own thing. He was a brilliant engineer. He was hired and fired by pretty much every major aviation company pre-World War II. The guy had an ego that was just huge, but he was a freaking genius. He developed a lot of things that we take for granted today, like retractable landing gear. He was really the first kind of person in the U.S. to really go big into retractable landing gear. He built a series of mail delivery planes in the 30s that really revolutionized aeronautics as we know it. Stress skin, all metal, retractable landing gear, cowl rings, all that good stuff like that. The guy was pretty damn smart.
He worked for Lockheed Vega at one point. I know that. He left there, and then
He worked for Lockheed, he worked for Douglas, he worked for Northrop, of course, his own company. I think he worked for North American too. He did a lot of. He was pretty much a mercenary. He pretty much went wherever the work was. So regardless of who it was for, what it was, he kind of did it. And at the same time, when he had his own company, he was still working on projects for other companies because the guy was a workaholic, absolute workaholic.
so that was like 20s, 1930s that all happened. I think in 1939 he created the Northrop company that we know for the P-61. He was over and basically, all right, so the P-61 came about because of the Battle of Britain, essentially. The Americans saw what was happening to the British during the night when the German bombers were hitting it, and they decided that we needed our own version of a night fighter. We never had anything like this before, and it was time to start designing something.
Well, let's kind of talk about the whole thing to begin with. The British were getting hammered at night by German bombers. They did have radar. It was very effective in locating and ranging the bombers. The problem is that by the time the fighters got off the ground and located and were directed to the bombers had already released their bombs and they were heading back home. So Jack Northrop was over in London trying to secure a contract for the Northrop Corporation to build Vengeance dive bombers that the British were all raving about. And that's a whole nother story. The airplane was actually pretty fucking terrible. But he was over there trying to secure work for his company, and just kind of suggested on the fly one night as he was at dinner with some guys from the Royal Air Force that what they needed was a dedicated night fighter that could take off at sunset and fly until sunrise and be airborne the entire time. So the British liked the idea. They sent out some specifications for it. Jack Northrop designed an airplane that met those specs. At the same time, someone over in England for the U.S. Army Air Forces got wind of this, ran it up the food chain, and then soon afterwards, the Army Air Force put out specifications for a purpose-built night fighter as well. And that's what became the P-61. Before that, we had several other night fighters. Night fighting was new to us. The first airplane we had that was our first kind of night fighter was the Douglas P-70, which is actually a very early A-20. I think it's the A-20A, actually. that that Douglas put in a British air radar in called an AI radar, air intercept radar. It was our first night fighter, very successful night fighter considering it was a big giant bomber or attack airplane, I should say. We also in the midterm, because the P-61 was having problems, we also in Europe used the Bofighter as a night fighter. U.S. did, and the U.S. also got limited numbers of Mosquitoes as night fighters as well.
And the P-61, when it came into service, eventually replaced all these squadrons that you hear and talk about right now.
That's correct.
All this stuff fought until the P-61 was produced and deployed.
Yeah, and the Bofighter and the Mosquito were pure stopgap measurements because of delays on the P-61 program. And actually, the Bofighter was a really, really, really good night fighter. Surprisingly well. The U.S., the guys that flew it, I think only 2 or 3 squadrons flew it. They really enjoyed it, and one squadron held on to the Bofighter actually after their P-61s were delivered. They let their P-61 sit for like another month before they started flying it because they did not want to give up the Bofighter. So, specifications called for an airplane that could fly 8 hours nonstop, top speed of about 350 to 400 miles an hour. And the Air Force required that they were to be powered by 2800 engines, Pratt & Whitney R2000s, and that they were going to have remote controlled 50 caliber machine guns. 2 companies responded to it. The first one was Northrop with his P-61, and the other company was Douglas with the A-26A. That's how the A-26 got its remote controlled turrets.
I did not know that.
Yep.
I thought that was just there for.
Nope.
All right.
So in the meantime, the P-61 was totally outclassed the A-26A. Douglas realized they actually had a much better airplane as an attacker than the A-26 as we know it came about.
The XP-61, the first drawings of it came about November 1940, so a year before Pearl Harbor. This aircraft has such an early date. I thought for sure this thing started in like 1941, 1942. It actually kicks back all the way to 1940. It didn't fly, though, until May 26, 1942, the first prototype. And it went through so many design changes, partially because of Northrop, and the Army actually had a lot of things that they wanted to be put in and then taken out and so on. So both parties kind of messed up the P-61's design timetable by making tons of changes. They made engine changes. This aircraft at one point it had 2 crew members, then it went up to 4, eventually it went to 3. There's a couple variations you can see that had drawings of a belly turret, and then they put the two cannons in each wing. Then they decided to move those 4 cannons underneath the belly. And there was 250 caliber on a dorsal turret on top, and then they changed that to the 4 that we have in the game and in real life. Tons of changes happened. I think even it had its tail changed, right?
Yeah, the tail was changed. Well, a bunch of stuff was changed. The Army originally rejected the twin tail boom design, and they went back to the drawing board and designed a single tail like a traditional airplane. Jack Northrop evidently fought tooth and nail for a twin boom airplane because I don't know why, he just did, because it was his ego.
It looks sexy, that's why.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how the airplane became twin boom airplane. Let's talk about the radar that's in it for a second. The radar that's in it is called the SCR-270. It's actually a version of a radar that was developed for spotlights on the ground. It was a lightened version of it that was used to control spotlights for the anti-aircraft gunners. That was really the only radar that we had available at the time here in the U.S. that could be shrunk small enough to get put in an airplane. The radar that was in the P-70 and in the Bofighter and some other airplanes was the British AI, or air intercept radar. And it wasn't radar in the traditional radar like we think of radar with the rotating dish and everything else like that. The SCR-270 did have a rotating dish. It was the first airborne radar to have the rotating dish. The AI radar had a bunch of antennas. They had transmission antennas and receiving antennas, and that's kind of a problem because the way that the airplanes were designed and the way that the antennas were made the actual structure of the fuselage could block the receiving part. So you could very easily be out there pinging your target and not know it because the wing's in the way or because the engine's in the way or something like that. So that's one of the reasons why they went to a dish instead. They mounted the dish up in the nose.
That's why that nose is so big and there's nothing else
Yeah,
there.
exactly.
It's all radar.
The dish itself rotated 360 degrees, and I think it moved like 45 or 50 degrees up and down at the same time. There was kind of a cool thing because they didn't want to nuke the pilots behind the airplane. When the dish swung around to 180 degrees behind, so facing aft, the radar itself actually turned itself off, and then when it swung past the cockpit, it turned itself back on. Very, very, very complex airplane.
I'm sure the pilots appreciated that.
Yeah, of course, because they could have children after the war and not be sterile. The radar system itself was actually incredibly complex. It took more man hours to maintain the radar system than the actual airframe itself, by far. It was all vacuum tubes and no transistors, just vacuum tubes and relays, and everything's all mechanical and everything else like that. It's a pretty unique system, actually. Very big, very heavy.
So the XP-61 came online, what was the date? May 26, 1942. It was able to reach 370 mph at 30,000 feet. That's pretty respectable. It had a max ceiling of, I think, 33,000 feet, so not too much higher. The Army was impressed, and they ordered 13 more pre-production models of the P-61.
Called YP-61s.
And then the Army got really kind of flaky. They were like, we want thousands of these. And then they immediately cut down the order to 207 because they weren't sure how this aircraft would work in combat. So this thing went under lots of testing. The first XP-61s that flew, they had tons of kind of feedback, and it was all productive criticism, but it was all kind of negative criticism at the same way. They had horizontal stability issues. I think they also had some, I believe, landing gear issues that they had to sort out. They had deep concerns about what would happen to the aircraft if they fired all 8 guns at once, the 4 on top and the 4 underneath. What happens if you fire all 8 guns?
They changed some stuff around. The P-61, as you can see in the game, has spoilers on the top of the wing to help it roll. Originally, the spoilers were the only roll surfaces on the airplane at all. Northrop designed these full span flaps that were, for some reason, I don't even know why they were designed. They were put on the XP-61. They proved to be incredibly unreliable, very heavy, and the airplane suffered in the roll. So what they ended up doing is they ended up going back to a traditional flap and aileron system, little tiny ailerons, but still with the spoilers.
Yeah, what's up with the underside? Like, the undersized ailerons look so silly.
Yeah, it's because it wasn't designed that way at all. It was thrown in there at the last minute because they needed more roll authority, and the only way they could do that was with ailerons.
So I thought that a spoiler popping up on top of the wing would be enough to to roll the aircraft.
Exactly. The problem is that at low speed you need more oomph than what the spoilers provide, so that's where the ailerons came in. They had a series of landing accidents. The airplane itself is actually pretty unique. It was claimed to be spin-proof, and I think only one person actually really successfully spun the airplane. Jack Northrop designed from the get-go for the airplane to be spin-proof, and the saying is that if you actually entered a spin with the airplane, all you had to do was take your hands off the controls and the airplane would right itself. And that's exactly how the guy who purposely spun the airplane, that's exactly what he did. He just put his hands up, let the airplane go, and it immediately automatically corrected itself.
Well, all I know is that these spoilerons were kind of revolutionary because, I mean, every airliner today uses spoilerons. So the fact that they had this technology back then is pretty substantial because it's still used tremendously today. Almost every airliner has spoilerons of some sort.
Then from there we have the P-61A, and this is where the plane kind of gets interesting. So we all see the turret that's on the P-61A and the P-61C that's in War Thunder. In reality, a lot of P-61s never had that turret.
The vast majority of P-61s did, and I think only the first 30 or so A models.
37 of the first, like,
yeah,
45.
and the last group of the B models, which isn't even in the game, had the turret. Most of them did not have the turret. And the reason why is because the turret, well, two problems. The turret itself is the same turret that's on top of the B-29. And because bombers at the time were the most important, the turret was made by General Electric. All the production for the turret went to the B-29 program, and so Northrop was basically screwed. They had no turrets to put on the airplanes, which is actually a good thing because the turrets provided a huge aerodynamic problem when the turret was not facing forward. The fairing on the turret caused tail buffeting, which led to some cracks on the tail booms of the airplane, which actually led to a design change. They changed from magnesium skin to aluminum skin, which is a little bit tougher than magnesium, due to the tail buffeting from the turrets. The A models that did have the turrets eventually had their turrets locked forward, and all the crap was taken out of the airplane. All the rear gunner stuff, the scopes and everything, all that other, the gun stuff was all taken out of the airplane, and the airplane gained about 15 miles an hour due to the weight decrease.
All right, so I have a question for both of you.
Yeah.
This isn't the first time I've heard the name magnesium skin in Northrop came up. Like, why was this a common practice for that age, or was it just...
Yeah, magnesium was much more readily available than the fancy ass aluminum alloys that we ended up using eventually.
Because most warbirds are made out of the latter.
Yeah, the problem with magnesium is that it burns. It's lighter than aluminum, and so it was used a lot of times instead of aluminum. But the problem is that it burns. So if you get in a crash, the airplane basically will catch itself on fire. That's not good.
From what I understand, magnesium was used primarily because the Americans, we thought we were going to have a major shortage of aluminum, and so it was almost thought as an alternate, at least from what I understand.
Yeah, that's very true as well. But we continued to use magnesium up until the 60s. The first 200 to 300 or so Bell Huey helicopters were all skinned in magnesium because it was lighter than aluminum.
Random information from Cobey.
Yep, my head's full of that shit.
The first problem with the P-61As that came out was limited range. The aircraft was limited by its internal fuel tanks. With a later model, they added external fuel tanks, which gave it range to basically fly all night. But another big advantage was it could later drop bombs and rockets from these. That's why you see the P-61A1 in-game has no ability to basically do any bombing, is because it didn't have the pylons. And then the C1 carrying game. C1 has the option to carry 4 1,000-pound bombs, which I think is, would you say, Ron, that's higher than what the aircraft could actually do?
Yeah, it was only rated for actually about 1,600 pounds worth of bombs. Not to say that they didn't do it at some point.
Whatever, I'm sure there's some document somewhere somebody went up with 4,000-pound bombs, and maybe that's what they went off of. Anyway, it's not important. Some other problems with the early A model was that the 20mm shell casings would jam in the ejection doors of the aircraft, and they later fixed that by putting open slots.
Well, that was all designed and done to just basically get the speed of the airplane up. Everything that could be covered with some aerodynamic fairing was covered. That's why the airplane's shaped the way it is. That's why the carburetor intake and stuff like that on the P-61 is actually inside the cowling and not outside of the cowling like on most airplanes. That's why the oil cooler is inside the cowling and not outside of the cowling, as it is on most airplanes. So they had these little hydraulic powered doors that would open up when they'd fire the guns. The problem is that they didn't open up all the time, and so the empty shell casings would back up and end up jamming the guns. So finally they said screw it and ended up putting normal ports on there like you see on pretty much every other gun or every other airplane around the world.
Yeah, even today.
Yeah, even today still. Yep, absolutely. Yep.
The 20mm cannons could also not be charged in the air. The AN-M2s were prone to failure, and they could only be charged on the ground. So if one of these things jammed or backed up, they were completely dead in the air until you got down and fixed it. So failure of these things was pretty much failure altogether. Or the P-38 used the same cannon, but it had the ability to recharge itself because it had a big ass mechanism that would pull it back and everything, and recharge it like a normal gun does. This plane did not have that capability. I mean, you did strap 4 20mm to the belly of an aircraft though, so there's room's a little limited.
Especially because it was basically an afterthought. Like I said, the airplane was originally designed with top and bottom remote control 50 50 caliber turrets on it, and so the Air Force changed their mind and wanted cannons on the airplane. So they basically put a tub on the bottom of the airplane that the cannons sit in.
And thankfully it did, because without the turrets, the aircraft's useless. So at least the cannons gave the aircraft some ability to keep in the fight with the shortage. The A1 used R2800-10 engines, which gave it 2,000 horsepower. The A5, which came out shortly afterwards, had the -65, which went to 2,250 horsepower. So right there, you're getting big boost. These engines were not turbo supercharged, which saved some weight, but it also probably helped with the maintenance and the production costs. But it also,
they had a mechanical supercharger, I think, on board, but it wasn't. I don't think it was anything special at all.
Right, but it didn't. It didn't make much sense. They could actually gain about 50 mph or something if they actually added the turbo supercharger off. Say with
50 miles an hour and 10,000 feet in altitude. Yep.
But for some reason they didn't do it. And just to keep in mind, if you don't know what the R2800 is, that's the engine from the Hellcat, the P-47, the Corsair. They're monster engines, and you put that on a twin engine fighter. It's
A26.
amazing. So, big, powerful, bulletproof engines.
Most produced radial engine ever made.
The A5 had the ability to climb to 5,000 feet in under 2 minutes, which is pretty impressive for a big plane that carries 3 people and 8 guns. One thing that's important to note, we'll talk about this pretty much in depth, is the A10 was the first designation that had the color change to glossy black. During the prototypes, the airplanes were painted flat black, and then you'll see them go to olive drab like we have in game with the A1, and then you even see them go unpainted, and then with the A10 became the famous glossy black paint scheme.
The reason why they went to gloss black instead of flat black is they did some experiments. Actually, they weren't really experiments. They were actually, but you can blame the British for this. The British painted their night fighters flat black, thinking that they would just disappear. The problem is that when spotlights were lighting up the airplanes over Germany, the gunners knew exactly where the airplanes were, because the flat black didn't give back any reflections and showed up as a dead space in the sky, and you could immediately see where they were. So they changed to gloss black, which kind of mimicked the haze of the horizon and stuff like that, and kind of reflected some of the light back.
But you would not think that a shiny object was something you want to fly at night, but...
Yep, exactly. I know it sounds backwards, but that's exactly what they needed.
So the P-61A saw service everywhere. Burma, China, Europe, Pacific, and then 4 squadrons in the Mediterranean that replaced the Beaufighters that Cobey was talking about earlier. In Burma, I was kind of surprised to find out that they went to Burma. You don't actually I never knew they went to Burma. But they were way too late, because most of the fighting was already done in Burma. Most of the planes were brought back to defend China or mainland Japan. So the P-61s were just there as the defense barrier. They also did quite a bit of ground attacking throughout the war. They shot down, not necessarily A models, but over the time they were there, they also killed 9 V-1 rockets. They were heading towards England. So they kind of saw service everywhere. In June 30, 1944, it saw the first kill in the Pacific on a Betty. Roan found that information earlier. I actually never knew. But yeah, the P-61's mostly famous, at least whenever I hear about it, for being in the Pacific theater. And it saw service on every continent. It's not a kind of misnomer. It also saw a lot of action at the Battle of Bulge for ground attacking. And it was actually called the Night Intruder. That was actually the nickname they gave it, because it didn't actually do that much night fighting. By the time the P-61s really went to service, most of the air-to-air fighting was kind of over, and it saw more ground attacking, anti-shipping, or just hitting installations than it did actual air-to-air combat. So remember we talked about the Vultee Vengeance earlier. The P-61, so you hear me say 1944. The aircraft was first designed in 1940, didn't hit service until mid-1944, which at this point the war is, we're already in Europe. Japan's being knocked back pretty good at this point. Well, Northrop took a contract to build the Vultee Vengeance in the States, as you heard, and when they were ready to produce the P-61, they took a contract to build 400 of these Vengeances, and they couldn't even use their own production lines to build their aircraft. And what did we get, like 260 of these stupid things? We somehow...
Well, they weren't stupid, but yeah, they weren't...
We ended up with them in our fleet, though, and we didn't know...
Because the British didn't want them.
What'd you say they were used as, Roan?
They were used as tugs. They pulled targets.
Target tugs, that's correct. They were also used as advanced trainers as well.
One of the most complicated aircraft of World War II was put on delay for a target tug. Then we have the P-61B, which is probably the more important P-61 to know about. It was the last production run, and it had a few changes. You can't really tell the difference between the P-61A and B from the outside. They look pretty similar.
You can. B's got a longer nose.
Well, 8 inches, but I mean, if
Yeah.
to the naked eye, at a distance, you're gonna look at the two planes, and I mean, it's not like radical changes. It does have different landing gear. I don't know if you want to talk about that a bit, or you and Roan, because this is beyond me.
As far as I know, the landing gear is the same. The doors were changed. The doors on the A model had one big giant door that stayed open, and the B models changed to a main gear door and then a small door for the strut. So when the landing gear went down, the main gear doors closed and just the strut doors stayed open.
And that was to keep mud and rocks from being flung into the...
That's correct, yeah. It also had nose wheel steering, which the A model didn't have. The A model had a castering nose wheel. And I think it also put a landing light on the nose gear as well. But the biggest change between the A and the B was the radar. They changed it from the 270A to the 270B or C, I think. And the big difference was the range. The A model was only good for about 5 or 6 miles. So you had to get within 5 or 6 miles of your target to actually pick it up on radar. And the C or the B model, I think it was the C model, had like a 25-mile range.
Another cool thing, though, that I just recently learned this year about the P-61B was it had night vision binoculars. 5.8 power, which is kind of random for a magnification. I don't know where they came up with that number. That had basically, I'll see if I can find a picture of it, had like 6 dots or 5 dots, and they would line it up from dot to dot, basically from wingtip to wingtip, and that's where they would shoot. The unit itself, though, weighed 350 pounds, and it was used by the pilot.
Something that now is the size of a cell phone. Back then was 350 pounds. I just think it's hilarious.
Yeah, that added quite a bit of weight to the aircraft. The B-10 had tail warning radar, which was found on a majority of aircraft. P-38s had it, P-51s had it, the B-10 P-61 had it. And then the B-15 is return of the freaking turrets. So this thing had night vision, it had tail warning radar, but it did not get its turret back until the B-15. Now, one thing you hear about when you talk about the P-61 and combat is how did it compare to the Mosquito? You're going to hear, especially with the British, they're going to say that the Mosquito is a better night fighter than the P-61 in terms of maneuverability and climbing and capability, and I think it's fair to say that both aircraft did well in their combat records, right? But I think it's fair to say that what one lacked, the other one kind of succeeded in.
Well, yeah, and you have to remember that the P-61 was a night fighter designed from the get-go to be a night fighter. The Mosquito was a high-speed bomber that happened to be a very maneuverable fighter that happened to be a very maneuverable night fighter.
But the Mossy saw by far more combat than the P-61 ever did.
Oh, yeah, by 1,000 times.
And then we have the P-61C, which we have in War Thunder. And it was actually designed for... Northrop knew that the invasion of mainland Japan was kind of imminent, so they designed this aircraft for that purpose. It had R-2000-73 engines. It could hit 430 mph at 30,000 feet. That's a pretty big performance jump over our earlier A model. Had a ceiling of 41,000 feet, which is that's really high for back then, 1944, 1945. Mm-hmm. 30,000 feet in less than 15 minutes. That's pretty impressive. And it was first delivered in July 1945, which makes that date not impressive because the war was over.
War was over by then, yeah. So I think there were only, 30-something P-61Cs built?
41 delivered and then canceled.
Yeah, and the last, 15, 16 of them were flown directly from the factory in Hawthorne, California to Kingman, Arizona and cut up on the spot.
That's it for the P-61. It did have the last unconfirmed kill of the war. It actually, I believe that they even shoot at it. It was just I think it was like an M1K or something, saw it, and then it crashed. So that somehow gave it the last unconfirmed kill. Anyway. Stories of World War II, But hey, good for the P-61.
The whole career of the 61 was pretty short. I think they were totally out of service by like 1949. Like
I said, they're more notable for ground attacking, shipping, and they did do a lot, but they weren't. There's only 700 of these things built, plus the ones that never entered service. So it's not like these things were everywhere. Even though they did see service lots of countries, they just weren't that many of them. All right, so let's talk about the Flying Wing at Goodyear. most of you out there, I believe, probably know about the Northrop flying wing, which they were kind of obsessed with, or Northrop was obsessed with.
Jack Northrop was obsessed with it, yes,
And
very
he
much
passed off the P-61D to Goodyear in Akron, Ohio, the same Goodyear that we have today, which is kind of scary to think about that company making airplanes.
They also made Corsairs. In fact, the vast majority of Corsairs flying today, the Dash 1s, are actually Goodyear-built Corsairs. Northrop was very heavily involved in the XB-35, YB-35 project and subcontracted out the C and D stuff to.
Like, he actually thought that the flying wing was going to be a legitimate aircraft for use in World War II.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
That hurts my head. Like, I mean, what we know about aviation today.
Well, we did some pretty unique stuff back then. You know, he was. Jack Northrop was always one that really pushed the edge of the envelope, and that's just proof right there that, you know.
He went all in.
His imagination was crazy.
All right, so the XP-61D was actually a pretty neat aircraft. I'd actually like this. This thing, if it actually entered service at a decent date, probably would have been something to be reckoned with. It had R2800, was it believe -77 engines, so we're getting up there in the R2800 production models. But most importantly, it has CH-5 turbo superchargers, which are the same turbo superchargers found on the P-47M, which is the exact same issue that the P-47M had, which means that the P-47Ms were delivered like November, December of 44. They didn't see service until, or they didn't see action until like May or April of 45 because they were so unreliable. Same issue with the XP-61D. They had the exact same issues on that aircraft, but it could hit 30,000 feet in under 13.5 minutes and had a max ceiling of 43,000 feet. So the performance gain by these things was pretty noticeable. The prototype was supposed to be delivered and flying by mid-1944. That didn't happen until November 1944. Goodyear had tons of issues. And the first prototype, I believe, snapped its landing gear, the front wheel, straight into the ground.
Yep.
And then it was repaired. Both aircraft there was a second one. Those were both ultimately scrapped.
Due to crashes.
No pilots were hurt. They just kept crashing for whatever reason. Now, so Cobey and I are having this debate that I thought that the XP-61, I thought the P-61D was going to be a follow-along model, like an improved version of the C. Cobey thinks that since it was just Goodyear producing this, like the P-51B and C, they're made by two different companies or two different plants, that they would that the P-61D was just a designation for Goodyear. And
yeah, that's what I think. The XP-61D, there was no production of P-61D. The XP-61D evolved into the P-61C, which was built by Northrop.
So you think they just took what they learned from the D and then pushed that into the C and then just ditched the CH-5 supercharger?
Well, I don't know if the CH-5 was in the C or not. I don't remember which one was on the C.
Don't think so. I think they just went.
I know it was. I know that it had a supercharger on it, but I don't know which one it was.
So this aircraft. So this pretty much the war's over. And then there were a few other random weird kind of prototypes, and then it had some notable post-war history. There's the XP-61E. Like I said, they knew that there was probably going to be a invasion of mainland Japan. Of course, that never happened, but to them, they knew that ultimately we would probably have to invade. So to the military, they were trying to design and get contracts out to do this. The problem was that if they could not get an airfield close enough to Japan, that none of the P-51s, P-38s, or P-47s were going to be able to escort it. So there's aircraft in existence that we know of called the F-82 or P-82. That became the long-range fighter plane to cover the B-29 in and out of Japan.
P-47N as well, that's not in the game, but eventually, hope it will be in the game, was designed to meet that requirement.
There was a handful of aircraft designed, or at least developed, for helping the B-29 in and out of Japan. The XP-61E was Northrop's contender for that contract. They were trying to pass it off as, well, it can be a long-range fighter and an attacker and a night fighter. And, they were just trying to say, like, it can do everything. Please buy this airplane. Eventually, they went with the cheaper F-82. And the F-82, talk about too long, but the F-82 is just cheap because we already had the tooling to make F-50 or P-51s, right? So North American, it didn't cost much for North American to do a lot to the F-82 because it was already mostly made. And then the F-82, which is funny, ultimately replaced the P-61 as the night fighter, especially when you go into Korea. You want to talk a bit about the F-82 radar system compared to the P-61 radar system?
The F-82 radar system was totally different. It was shrunk down. The F-82 didn't have radar. It became a night fighter, I think, in the G model, and it was totally different from the P-61. Much improved. By the time the F-82 came about, the radar, had been shrunk and much more reliable, so on and so forth.
P-61 was a brilliant plane for a moment, and then that moment passed, and then
Yep.
And then you can even see the Bearcats. I believe some of the Bearcats had
Radar.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it was just on their wingtip.
Tiger Cat as well.
They could just pack it onto the tip of a wing, and then ta-da, it's on there.
Tiger Cat had radar as well.
So the use for a 100% night fighter was kind of gone, whereas another aircraft that could do multiple things could also be a night fighter. So your Tiger Cat that could do ground attacking could also be a night fighter, essentially. There is another aircraft to mention, though, is the F-15, and not the F-15 Eagle, the F-15 Reporter.
Yeah, back then F was photo reconnaissance, not fighter.
And these aircraft had a pretty big deal because I believe they took pictures of most of Asia, right? Like they went through Japan.
Yeah, I think most of our maps and stuff during the Korean War were actually created from photographs taken by the F-15. It was a long-range reconnaissance, photo reconnaissance airplane that was eventually built. The competition was between Northrop and Hughes, and that famous crash that Howard Hughes really messed him up in when he crashed into that beet field outside of Hollywood was when he was flying his company's prototype for that contract. Of course, they lost it. The F-15 went into production. I think they only made 35, 40 of them or so. They weren't in service very long at all. Pretty much after the Korean War, they were all surplused. And I think the last one flew up until the mid-60s as a firebomber here in California.
I never knew that. That's interesting. Yeah, F-15 had no armament on it, I believe. The turret was completely removed. It was
It was just a high-speed reconnaissance airplane. It was supposed to do 500 miles an hour. I don't think it did anywhere near that, but I think the contract called for 500 miles an hour top speed.
All right, Ron, you've been pretty quiet, so now you're going to press us with the meteorology. Well, a few things we forgot to mention real quick. We'll go back before we talk about the meteorology. Is the changes between the P-61A and the B and C that you see in game. The C has these actually kind of cool air brakes that pop out the top. Do you remember what variant that was added in?
In the B model. The B model was the first version to have those. I think they were called Zap Flaps, or I forgot what the hell they were called. It was a Northrop thing.
And they also changed I believe it was the engine cooling system, right, or the exhausts.
Put more cowl flaps on the airplane because the airplane liked to overheat.
And then you have the little scoop underneath the engine.
For the carburetor air intake, yeah.
So kind of neat little just additions. So I guess it's just all improvements on the aircraft. But anyway, that's what you'll see in game between your C and A, is just little additions, and then the pylons you'll see, and so on. All right, you ready, Roan?
P-61 was very useful after the war. It was part of a project called the Thunderstorm Project. And this is where they used the aircraft to penetrate thunderstorms, because we, up until this point, pretty much had no major basis. We only had theories as to why thunderstorms were the way they were. And using the P-61 and its radar in the nose, slightly modified, NACA, the predecessor for NASA, flew these airplanes into thunderstorms to get data, and all of this data is still used today, and it's very frequently used by the mesoscale system. Pretty much all of our theory today into thunderstorms comes from the Thunderstorm Project, where the P-61 was the primary aircraft. It's pretty huge, because in aviation, weather is a very important thing. It's one of those things that can kill pilots, kill me, any heartbeat.
Yeah,
so.
Thunderstorms are not good.
And then the P-61 is used for testing a couple other things. A lot of other aircraft were used too. So the P-61 is not kind of special in this way, but it was used for a few ejection seat tests. You'll see pictures of that around the internet. And then they hooked, was it ramjets onto it for testing?
Yeah, it was used as an engine test bed. Used all sorts of good stuff. It was because it was a pretty fast airplane, a pretty big airplane, a lot of room inside. It could carry a lot. It was used for a lot of special projects like that immediately after the war.
So it made contributions besides being a night fighter. It's just a unique aircraft. I don't know if you call this thing That's, I don't know. It's so weird, right? Like it wasn't like a real game changer in World War II, but it was just something that should be noted in the aviation history. At least I believe.
Yeah, it was definitely, if there could ever be a niche airplane, the P-61 was certainly a niche airplane. It fulfilled one role really well. That was of a night fighter, and that's really it. But by the time the airplane came into maturity, its need was not needed anymore because we had advancements and all sorts of other stuff, and we also had air superiority over Europe, and finally air superiority over Japan. So it wasn't really needed. That's why
Only 700 were made.
it wasn't in service very long. You don't need an airplane that big to carry a radar system that big that can now be slung under the wing of a single seat fighter. Just goes to show you how fast technology advanced during World War II. I mean, that's a good example. Look at the difference between 1940 to 1945. We gone from fabric covered airplanes with two bladed wooden props like on the Spitfire to counter-rotating propellers on the later Spitfires. It's a great example right there. Technology just jumped so fast during the war that it just wasn't needed anymore.
There's only like 3 or 4 of these things in static display in museums, I believe, and there's one that's being restored for almost 15 years now. That someday it should be able to
At
fly.
least, yeah. It was pulled out of the jungle and think in New Guinea or something like that. It's been slowly under restoration for years. The place that has it has just been constantly battling with money issues. I know they've got both engines now, and I think they've only got one prop, and I think they're kind of fundraising for another prop. The airplane is nowhere near being airworthy, but when it is finished, and it'll hopefully eventually be finished in the next 10 years if everything goes right, it'll be probably the best restored World War II airplane out there flying, period.
It'd be really cool to see one of these again.
Yeah, they're sparing no expense to get done in the first place right the first time.
That's awesome. And if you ever want, I'll link it below. Cobey and I once watched one random weekday night. We watched about 7/8 of this stupid video on, I think it was Xeno's Warbirds, which is a great channel. All of you should check it out.
Yeah, it's awesome.
And it has a instruction video from 1944 or something of how to fly your P-61, and you understand. You watch that, you understand how complex this aircraft is to fly.
Yeah,
and
it's ridiculous.
And if you want, and the joke is like, if you want to put down your landing flaps, first turn off the turn off the pilot heater, and then turn off your light, and then crank your
everything in some way, shape, or form involved turning the heater off to begin with. You want to do anything with the airplane, you want to adjust your seat, turn the heater off, and then adjust your seat.
Yeah. To do one thing, to move the flaps, there's like 10 other things you have to do. You hit these 5 breakers here, and then twist this knob, and then look left, look right, and then hit the landing gear. Like, anyway.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
It's pretty.
Yeah, you
funny.
should check it out.
It's a very complex airplane. Very, very, very complex airplane. In fact, that was probably one of its biggest downfalls, was that it was just, same with the P-38 as well. The airplane was just so complex, it was too complex for its own good.
All right, like I said at the beginning, if you have a 5-kill Air RB match that you'd like to share with us, we have a little special podcast. Actually, I haven't told these guys what I'm going to do. It'll be a fun podcast coming up. Basically, I'm going to have us choose 4 or 5 planes that we'd like to see added to War Thunder, and then explain why. And hopefully that'll lead to some interesting discussion, maybe a little debate. And so we'll love to play your skills in the background. Anyway, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you in a bit.
Bye-bye.